Oh, this is so wonderful to meet so many friends from throughout Humboldt County, especially warm welcome to our Roman Catholic friends. It's nice to meet Father Michael, who was actually at Abbey of Redwood, same time Thomas Merton was. Yeah, but unfortunately, they never actually got to meet, but in the same time, same place. Let's, I just want to kind of have us gather again. We'll have a lot more time to chat during our lunch hour.
Make sure you leave me some donuts.
Yeah.
Are they gone?
Father Michael had a donut.
I gotta tell you, I eat very well when I'm here.
Indeed.
I do.
We're gonna get back into it. We're just gonna dive back in, and
Wow.
hopefully you guys will be joining us. So glad you're all here.
It's amazing.
Beautiful. Hi.
Get an autograph
Yeah, can I do it at lunch?
after.
For lunch? Yeah. I'd be happy to. Okay. Gonna pick up where we left off here. I really appreciate everyone bringing their voices forward when we did this sort of the Q&A. It's helpful for me, and it's a gift to hear your stories and for you to bring your voices forward into this space. Many of you have lived this, not the material itself. You've lived into this space and into this place for many decades. And I think it's important to bring that here. Daniel and I went on a beautiful walk yesterday to the lighthouse, the ranch house, Lolita. And we were talking about how nature just waits for us to acknowledge. Like nature is waiting for us to return its gaze. Now, the trees want us to see them. The plant life wants to be witnessed. And that's partly what our job is, I think, as human beings, is to be in relationship with nature in that sort of an intentional way. So when we talk about the beauty of these places, the world shines on us because it says, thank you. Thank you for seeing me. That's what I'm here for. I'm here to be seen. So you can think about that next time you're on a sacred saunter. That's all I do. I'll just plug you. Okay, so we're going to talk about the May material before lunch. In a very interesting journal entry that, Merton's journals, he had in his will, his literary will, he had like a clause that the journals couldn't be published until a certain period of time after he had died. So the journals were finally published only in the mid and late 90s, which happened to be when I was an undergraduate and when I was getting into all this stuff. So I was able to read the journals as they were published. And I came across this passage, just this middle passage here. It's very cryptic. He's writing this on his way to California. And it's kind of like a stream of consciousness, just a list of things, but very interesting things. Nazareth, the Beguines, the mystics of the Rhineland, the beginning of modern consciousness. Garments of skin in the Greek fathers. Hindu koshas, then modern consciousness. Montaigne, Descartes, Pascal, Sufis, and Zen. So what is this? Well, what this actually is, and I wasn't able to put this puzzle piece together until I was working on this book, this is actually the list of topics that he planned to address with the sisters at Redwoods Monastery. What a far-reaching and wild comparative approach to basically everything, which is, for those of you that know Merton's writing, that is Merton to a T. Okay? And then I came across this letter that he wrote to Miriam Dardan right around the time of this journal entry, where he basically says the same in his letter to her. The subject I'd like to pursue is the modern religious consciousness, which means wondering if such a thing exists, and if so, what shape does it take on? And then this is against the traditional background of religious consciousness in Zen, Sufism, the Cistercians, St. Benedict, the Desert Fathers, right? So you can see this is the kind of argument that he's setting up. It's this compare and contrast between modern consciousness and religious consciousness. And that's basically how he begins, and that's how he sets the whole thing up for the May conferences, okay? So what he means by religious consciousness is a type of worldview or a type of outlook where God or some sort of theistic paradigm becomes the center of your worldview. Okay? God is the center. It's a universe, it's a metaphysic, it's a cosmology that is God-infused. That there's a sense of the divine presence that permeates one's reality and one's worldview. Okay? To Merton, this is a type of consciousness, this is the type of worldview or perspective that we have lost in the modern West. And folks like to tend to blame it on that French mathematician René Descartes. It's not just his fault. It was a massive cultural, societal shift that started to privilege reason, rationality, science, and materialism over and against what we could refer to as a form of mythic or mythological consciousness, or we could call it theistic consciousness or a theological worldview. Something happened at some point in the evolution and the transformation of Western thought that shifted the paradigm more towards the interior, the human, the individual, the separate, the scientific, the rational, the cognitive. And something, according to Merton and other folks, because this is not his argument alone, something has been lost. And the way that this oftentimes gets set up today is this sort of sacred versus secular kind of thing. But I also see it the way that you're probably familiar with the phrase spiritual but not religious, the sort of spiritual but not religious worldview has also exploded, particularly since the 1960s and particularly since the beginning of the 21st century. So Merton is talking about these different shifts in culture as types of shifts in consciousness. So he unpacks this notion of modern consciousness first, and then he compares and contrasts different types of religious consciousnesses from traditional religious and mystical traditions. Does that make sense, this basic setup? A lot of us we're living in it. We're living in this. And I think for people that are mystics and spiritual folks and Jungian psychologists and, people that are seekers, I think get this. Because it's what we come up against when we live in a culture and in a worldview that is kind of constantly trying to convince us that, well, all that we see is all that there is. That would be sort of a scientific materialistic worldview. Or you're only real if you buy stuff, right? The level of how much you spend and consume is equivalent to the level of how real a person you are, right? So the more full your Amazon cart is, it establishes you more in your human reality, right? That's a consumerist model, consumer consciousness. Merton is trying to present us with various alternatives, other ways to be human in this world, more of a God-centric or what we might consider a mystical perspective. Right? He's basically teaching us how do we be modern mystics in a world that in a lot of ways doesn't really care about mysticism, much less God. Okay, so Merton describes the condition of modern consciousness, the condition of us existing in this fishbowl of modern consciousness. He describes it as a bird in the air with no stable support that needs to maintain itself by beating its wings. You have to keep acting, keep moving, keep swimming, otherwise you will sink. So what he's pointing towards is the kind of vacuum that scientific materialist consumer consciousness creates. It creates a tremendous amount of alienation, anxiety, and depression. Because we're living in a worldview that if it is de-animated, if it is a de-animated, soulless kind of consciousness that we're being initiated into in our sort of modern scientific materialist kind of culture, where's the sense of meaning? Where's the sense of purpose? What's the answer to the why are we here at all question? Right? So Merton is trying to bring us back to these deeper questions of what it means to be here and to be human. Right? To Merton, we are deeply wounded with a sense of our possible nothingness, and with the sense that if we don't do something about it, we will disappear. So this is the kind of American addiction to workaholism, where I become defined by what I do in the world, which means that if I don't or can no longer do the thing, then all of a sudden, somehow my identity or my existence, it's like it doesn't matter. So it feeds this constant cycle of I need to do more so I can, again, continue to affirm that I exist. Now, Merton was seeing this firsthand with the young monks, the novices who were coming into the monastery. They were very neurotic, and they were bringing all of the wounds of their past and their history with them into the monastery, and they had no tools of what to do with it once they came face to face with themselves in the monastery, because they had no distractions. You could only milk the cows and pull the carrots so many times a day, right? It's a lot of time where it's you and you, or you and God. So they were coming to Merton for spiritual direction. And he was noticing a tremendous amount of anxiety and depression, and people just feeling generally alienated from a sense of stability inside themselves. So he was very concerned about this. And what he noticed with his novices is the same thing he noticed with himself. That what we are really struggling to convince ourselves of is, are we loved? Are we worthy of love? Can we be loved? Right? So this is his concern, is how do we enter into the heart? How do we return home? Right, this theme again of home. How do we return home to ourselves, but beyond that into the deeper ground of our identity, which is grounded in God? And what he says is that if the ground of our existence is an immediate experience of God, we would get a radically different kind of consciousness. We would be very different people if our ground was rooted in something deeper than the bird just flapping its wings to keep afloat or to keep in the air. If we can let go and let God, we can drop down into a deeper sense of consciousness, a different kind of reality. We would basically walk around with a different outlook or worldview. And what one of the examples that he gives is the redwoods, the trees themselves. Because he talks about when you have a capitalist or a consumer consciousness, trees are no longer trees. Trees become profit. Trees become paper. Trees become lumber. Trees become a thing to kill, to buy, to sell. In a different kind of consciousness, we could call it ecological consciousness, we could call it mystical consciousness, we could call it a God-soaked consciousness, trees become radiant. Trees become messengers. Trees become witnesses to the divine. Trees shine like the sun. Right? I know that's the gospel of Christ Church Eureka, is that the trees shine like the sun. And it should be. It should be. Sacred Saunter, again, for those of you that aren't familiar. Sacred Saunter is not worshiping among the trees. It's worshiping with the trees. They're with you. right? They're with you, are the creeks and the ferns. It's all part of the divine liturgy. Right? So it's a different kind of consciousness, but we have to cultivate it. We have to practice it. We have to walk it. So what Merton does is he gives these nuns, this community of sisters, and then now by proxy through us, alternatives, different kinds of spiritual practices, so that we can develop alternate types of consciousness. Right? It's a type of prophetic witness to stand in the world and to be, as many of you have probably been throughout your lives, allies for the trees. You have to go against the grain of a society that mostly wants to pulp them, right? It creates friction. So we have to practice so that we can stay awake and we can maintain our contemplative consciousness or our ecological consciousness. It involves practice and discipline. And yoga is one of the ways that Merton sees the potential for developing this alternative kind of consciousness. Right? Now, it's very interesting. He mentions this notion, which not a lot of folks have probably heard about. It's this notion in Hindu yoga psychology, or it's really like a psychophysiology or a psycho-spiritual approach to the human person. The Sanskrit word is kosha, the koshas, and it translates as sheaths. They're sheaths, they're different bodies. Most of us, again, I'm not an anti-science person, but it's not the whole story. But most of us that grew up with a pretty standard scientific education, we're taught that we are a cellular physical being with different types of systems, a nervous system, an endocrine system, a digestive system, and that's what we are. That's it. But in more, we could call it mystical psychologies or types of religious consciousness, there's a notion that we actually are composed of multiple bodies or identities, sort of like a Russian doll approach to human consciousness. And in the Hindu tradition, there's this notion that there are five. There are 5 bodies or 5 sheaths. There's the outer sheath, the physical sheath, the Annamaya kosha. There's the breath body or the energy body, the Pranamaya kosha. Then there's the mind. Then there's wisdom. There's a wisdom body. So we actually have a wisdom sheath, or there's something that's inherent to the human person that is wise. All right? And then at the center, the bliss body, the Anandamaya kosha. That at the center of the human person, we're not just the anxious, neurotic bird trying to flap to keep ourselves in there. It's actually, the core of the human person is actually an experience of divine bliss. Really? I thought it was original sin. I'm Catholic. At least that's how I was raised. All right? So experiencing oneself from a perspective of bliss is very different than experiencing oneself with a core or a wound of shame. Right? Daniel and I have been talking about Matthew Fox a lot. Matthew Fox's notion of original blessing. That's a very different shift than original sin. It's not a shame core. The human person was not created to carry a wound through life. That there's actually a wisdom that's inherent in, we could call it the psyche, in the soul, in the human person, that orients towards healing. When we are cut, at least for most of us, when we have a cut, it heals. Even trees. If a tree is slashed, it can heal itself. The orientation towards the self is towards healing and towards wholeness, but there's lots of things that get in the way. That's why if we have a wound, the first thing we have to do is clean it. Right? So for Merton, with this notion of the koshas and in yoga, the work, the discipline, the practice is to actually unveil, to be able to sort of unstack the Russian doll approach so that we can continue to shed these layers of the self and to not identify with any aspects of the self that are not connected to who we might be at a more sort of core or deeper level of our personhood. In Christian terms, we would say, how do we put on Christ? This is very Pauline. Right? This is straight, a lot of this is straight St. Paul. His whole notion about, I live no longer I, but Christ lives in me. That's another way to talk about this. So for Merton, his interpretation is that we take off our 5 garments so that at some level of our being, we are able to remain in utter nakedness, in direct seeing and direct contact and direct communication with the divine. That's actually what we were made for. That kind of, the Greek word is parrhesia. Parrhesia. It's a Greek word for free speech that was used to describe the citizens of Athens. That if you were a citizen of the city-state of Athens, you had certain rights and privileges, and one was freedom of speech. And what the early church fathers, the patristic period, what they did with this term is that they would connect this to Adam and Eve, this notion of returning to the garden, so that we can learn again through taking off these, what they call the garments of skin. These were the clothes that God made for them after they were kicked out of the garden. If you are able to remove these garments of skin or to remove these sheaths, we are able to restore this type of intimacy and freedom of speech that we can walk with God again as we once did. Right? So what Merton ends up doing is this kind of comparative thing, right, where we can look at the yoga tradition, we can look at the Hindu tradition and this notion of the sheaths and the selves, and then he's like, hey, guess what? This is something that's very much in our own Christian tradition, right? And he does this beautiful and this is I'm pulling together his writings from a few different works here. But what he does is he's doing this comparative connection between the Christian tradition, Christian spirituality, and the yoga tradition here. Does that make sense? Right? This notion of recovery and restoration of the self. He's drawing on that passage from Genesis where God and Adam walk in the garden and like the wind is blowing and rustling in the leaves, and it's basically like they're walking along the lost coast together. So how do we have this kind of restored intimacy with God? It involves shedding layers of falsity, shedding these layers of duplicity that keep us from ourselves, keep us from the truth of who we are, keep us from intimacy with God. Make sense? Okay. Another piece that he does is with Islam. And if we don't have time, we can pick this up again after lunch, because I don't think we're going to have time to finish all this. What he does with Islam is that he focuses on the mystical tradition, which is Sufism, the Sufi tradition, the mystical tradition of Islam. And what he focuses on is this notion of the secret. The idea of the person, of us, that we are secrets. This is a big thing in the Sufi tradition, right? That the person is composed of the heart. So the heart is the core of the person in the Sufi tradition. We're composed of a heart, and we're all composed of a secret. Right? So Merton is playing on this notion. And the way that he describes Islam is that Islam, particularly in its mystical or spiritual tradition, tries to return us to our original deep inner identity, which is veiled from us. So again, we're going from the koshas, the Russian doll approach, these 5 different layers of the self, the garments of skin in the Christian tradition, and now he's continuing this notion of being veiled, being covered with Sufism and Islam. So there's kind of a through line here. Right? And what he says is that this deepening of consciousness that Islam or that Sufism invites us into is obedience, as Islam means. Islam means surrender. So the deepening of consciousness is obedience to God's deepest purpose in creating me. That God creates us with these secret dimensions of our being, and the purpose of our life is to work, to do our spiritual work, to open up these secrets that are impregnated within us by our very creation and by our very being. Right? It's secret in the sense that we have to dig, we have to get to it. Right? So what is the secret? The secret is part of the divine design that is built right into our being. But again, the problem is that we forget it. So it becomes this lost and found. And Daniel made this wonderful connection between this whole spirituality of being lost and found and being on the lost coast. And you were saying Redwoods Monastery, but I could say Christ Church Eureka. Christ Church Eureka is the secret. It is the hidden secret. It's the hidden jewel. So it's finding or returning or recovering the secret that's in us, this personal center. And again, so Merton's developing from the Islamic tradition this notion of the mithaq, covenant, the mithaq, the covenant, that even prior to our creation, there is this divine design that is built into us as a covenant in which we have already said yes to God. We've already said yes. That's how we've ended up here. We've ended up here in this specific lifetime, in this particular incarnation, because prior to our soul's journey, we've already said yes. We've already said yes to God. Even with all of the heartache and the heartbreak and the trauma of this human existence, we've already said yes. Which means that we've already been endowed with the strength and the grace to face everything that this life has brought to us. This yes that we've already said is the deepest aspect of our personhood. It is the deepest ground. It is the inner secret of the heart. And I don't think he means this in some sort of Pollyanna, sugar-coated sort of way. I think he means it in this absolute, tremendous way that what we are saying yes to is not usually, if not always, easy. What it means to say yes to fully to this life. Now, what our work is to continue to say yes throughout our life. Because it's very easy for us, once we get here, to start saying no. No, thank you. I know I said yes to this, but I actually don't really want this. I don't really want to be here. All right? I'm actually not really having a good time, God. Can I go back? But what Merton is saying is that we have to continue to consciously make our yes ours. We have to continue to fully appropriate and say this yes, and it's only when we're able to fully say yes to life can we continue to fully step into our humanhood and our personhood. This is what the Jungians call individuation. Individuation is not just becoming an individual, it's becoming a self who's aligned with my divine design that's been implanted into my very soul. The problem is that when we say no to this yes, then we turn into the bird. Because then we think that we have to do it all alone or do it all ourselves. And we don't depend on God. And we stop relying on other people. All right? And then we're stuck again. Because then we're just the bird that needs to flap its wings to keep running away from ourselves. All right? For Merton, however, and this is the mystical dimension of Islam, there comes a time when the yes that one makes is so profound that it also involves the renunciation of the ground of one's own self. Now, what this means is that one day the thing that we're supposed to say yes to is yes, the ground of the self must go. Even the ground of the self must go. For many of us, that moment comes when we breathe our last breath. That is the ultimate surrender. That is our ultimate yes. Yes, you gave me this life, and yes, thank you. Here comes Sister Death. So for some of us, that's a practice, is preparing for that. That the yes that we have to ultimately say at some point in our life is this ultimate, even renunciation of our own being as we give it back to God. Thank you for this physical form that I was able to borrow for this certain period of my life. Thank you. Here you go. I'm giving it back to you. But for a lot of us here, and I imagine many people in this room, you've probably had to say, yes, the ground of the self must go many times in your lives. There are many of us that are invited to die before we die. And sometimes that is a process that we continue to go through. Right? And for those people, when we are able to fully say, yes, the ground of even the self must go, in mystical consciousness, at that particular point, there is nothing left but God. And when you realize that there is nothing left but God, you realize that that's you. You fall through the bottom of everything and you come out in God. It is not at all just simply being absorbed in God, but being lost and found. It's a death and it's a resurrection. And I think that that's what Christians, however you interpret that for yourself, I think that's what it means to be a Christian, is to live the Paschal mystery. It is to live this mystery with every breath and fabric and fiber of our being, that out of death comes life. We are an Easter people. Hallelujah. All right. That's the mystery. Lost and found. We are in this perpetual game of hide and seek with God, just as we are with ourselves and often our partners. So this is really, for me at least, sort of the climax or the pinnacle of some of the May material. It's this shift away from the anxious self that's not able to fully settle down and trust that God has your back. So there's the constant hovering and the flight. Right? But if we're able to drop down and trust that there are those hands of the Creator holding us in our brokenness, then we can settle in to this shift in worldview to more of a God-centered consciousness. But, as we know how God treats God's friends. And sometimes when we think we're able to rest in that nest, the ground just falls out from underneath us again. But if we can keep trusting, if we can trust that if we fall through the bottom of everything, if we can trust that we will come out in God, we realize that's you. And that's the ultimate mystery of the tradition. And to quote that great mystic Meister Eckhart, that the ground of the soul and God's ground are the same ground. That is the mystery in all of it. Okay? So I think this is the place that we will pause for lunch. Part of me is like, let's all eat in silence. Wouldn't that be fun? But I will let you do what you need to do because this is your retreat day.
Thank you. Wow. I'm getting the thumbs up from Steve. There are vegetarian options, correct? I just feel compelled to reflect briefly. This yes to life is such a powerful concept for me. And I'm also aware that I've lived a life of privilege. The other book that many of us have studied together this last year or so is also about a bird. There's a metaphor of a bird. And that's the life of Betty Chin. And there's something about this saying yes. So there's this dialectical tension. I don't want to go so far to say somebody who's suffering beyond anything I can imagine chose that. That's hard for me to swallow, right? And that can lead to blaming the victim. So there's this tension that I'm just feeling between what we're just hearing and this amazing life of Betty Chin. And yet there's also something that makes me, that breaks my heart open in a really beautiful way when I think about Betty Chin. When I think about her, yes. I mean, thank you. I'm holding these together, and it's blowing my mind. And there's this bird that helps her. When she says no, the bird says, "Oh, yes." Thank you for being here, Betty. Thank you for being here, Karen. I love the idea, because I feel like the Holy Spirit just showed up, for me at least. Let's be silent. Let's walk in silence into Father Louis Hall. And then once we're there, let's have some conversation together. Thank you all for being here. Thank you all for saying yes to being here now.